When people think of billionaires, they usually picture massive yachts, private jets, and lavish mansions. But behind one of India's greatest business success stories lies a very different tale. One of heartbreak, sacrifice, and a love story that changed everything. For decades, Ratan Tata was known as India's most eligible bachelor, the man who transformed a family business into a $100 billion global empire, never married. He lived alone in a simple apartment in Mumbai, drove himself around in a Tata car, and devoted his life to building one of the world's largest business empires. But why? The answer takes us back to the 1960s, to a love story that was crushed by the winds of war and circumstances beyond anyone's control. But before we get there, we need to understand who Ratan Tata really was and how his early life shaped the choices he would make. Let's go back to December 28, 1937, in Mumbai, India. The British still ruled the country, and the Tata family was already a powerful name in Indian business. This was the world Ratan Naval Tata was born into. But his early years weren't exactly what you'd expect for the heir to an industrial empire. When Ratan was just 10 years old, his parents split up. Instead of living with either of them, he ended up being raised by his grandmother, Navajabi Tata. She wasn't just any grandmother. She was the widow of Ratan Tata, and she ran a tight ship. Living with her in the family's mansion, young Ratan learned early on about responsibility and expectations. Life wasn't easy for the young heir. He went to the Campion school in Mumbai, where classmates would often tease him about his surname. "But you don't look like a Tata," they'd say, referring to his father, Naval Tata's adoption into the family. But he endured, and these early experiences taught him humility and resilience that would later become his trademark. As a teenager, Ratan bounced between several schools, from Cathedral and John Connon School in Mumbai to Bishop Cotton School in Shimla, and finally to Riverdale Country School in New York. Each move brought new challenges, but also helped him develop the adaptability he'd need later in life. In 1955, Ratan made a choice that surprised many. He decided to study architecture at Cornell University. Here was the heir to one of India's largest industrial groups, choosing to design buildings rather than learn about business. But that's who Ratan was, someone who followed his own path. The America that Ratan encountered in the late 1950s was a world away from the traditional society he'd grown up in. This was America on the cusp of the 1960s, a time of change, possibility, and new ideas. For the first time in his life, Ratan could just be himself, not the Tata heir. He threw himself into his studies, joined the Alpha Sigma Pi fraternity, and started thinking about building a life in America. After graduating in 1962, his talent caught the eye of famous architect A. Quincy Jones, who invited him to work at his prestigious firm, Jones and Emmons, in Los Angeles. This is where our story takes its first major turn. Los Angeles in 1962 wasn't just any city. It was a place of dreams and new beginnings. And for Ratan Tata, it became the setting for what would turn out to be the most important personal chapter of his life. Working at Jones and Emmons, Ratan met Carolyn Emmons. She was 19, the daughter of Frederick Earl Emmons, one of the firm's partners. From the moment they met, something clicked. This was something entirely different from anything he had experienced before. Carolyn would later describe Ratan as her first true love. And it wasn't just the young couple who felt the connection. Carolyn's parents adored Ratan. Her mother thought he was the most wonderful thing that could happen to her daughter. Everything seemed perfect. But then came the call that would change everything. Back in India, Ratan's grandmother had fallen ill. The same woman who had raised him when his own family fell apart now needed him. Without hesitation, Ratan packed his bags and headed home, promising Carolyn he'd return or she'd join him in India soon. Then history stepped in, and everything changed in a way nobody could have predicted. On October 20th, 1962, tensions between India and China finally boiled over. The conflict had been brewing for months over disputed borders in the Himalayas. But when Chinese troops launched a massive offensive across the McMahon line, it caught everyone by surprise. Suddenly, India was at war. Back in Los Angeles, Carolyn and her family watched the news with horror. Every day brought new headlines about battles in the mountains, about Indian troops fighting in freezing conditions against a much larger Chinese army. The country that was supposed to be Carolyn's new home had become a battleground. For Americans watching from thousands of miles away, India seemed to be teetering on the edge of chaos. This was a full-scale war between the world's two most populous nations. Even when a ceasefire was declared in November, the damage was done. The region remained unstable, and the threat of renewed conflict hung in the air. Carolyn's parents, who had once been so supportive of her relationship with Ratan, now couldn't imagine letting their daughter move to what looked like a war zone. Every news report, every image of troops in the Himalayas, every discussion of possible escalation made India seem further and further away from the safe, promising future they had imagined for their daughter. The separation that was supposed to be temporary started stretching into something more permanent. Letters traveled between Los Angeles and Mumbai. But in those days, before email and smartphones, communication was slow and difficult. Time zones made phone calls complicated. When it was evening in Los Angeles, Mumbai was already in the next day, and international calls were so expensive that they had to keep them short. Week by week, month by month, their connection began to fade, not because they wanted it to, not because they loved each other any less, but because their world had thrown an impossible obstacle in their path. Their love story, which had seemed so perfect in the California sunshine, was becoming another casualty of global politics. With a broken heart, this was the beginning of his transformation into one of India's most influential business leaders. In the 1970s, he started taking on responsibilities within the Tata Group. His first major test came with National Radio and Electronics, Nalco, a struggling subsidiary. He threw himself into work, maybe trying to forget what he'd left behind in Los Angeles. He turned Nalco around, showing the first glimpses of his business acumen. But then, an economic downturn hit, and the company struggled again. It was an early lesson in the ups and downs of business life. The real challenge came in 1991, when J.R.D. Tata stepped down as chairman of Tata Sons and named Ratan his successor. Many doubted whether this quiet, unassuming man could lead such a massive organization. The old guard didn't make it easy for him. They were used to running their divisions like personal fiefdoms. But Ratan had a vision. He started making changes that would transform the Tata Group from a collection of loosely connected companies into a global powerhouse. He set retirement ages for senior executives, made subsidiaries report directly to the group office, and started looking beyond India's borders. Under his leadership, the Tata Group made bold moves. They bought Tetley Tea in 2000, giving them a foothold in the global beverage market. Then came the big ones, Jaguar Land Rover and Chorus Steel. Each acquisition turned heads and raised eyebrows. But Ratan proved the doubters wrong every time. He even fulfilled a personal dream, creating the world's most affordable car, the Tata Nano. He wanted to help Indian families move from dangerous two-wheelers to the safety of four-wheels. The car might not have been a commercial success, but it showed what drove him, not just profits, but making life better for ordinary people. During these years of triumph and transformation, Ratan remained single. There were rumors, speculation, and countless attempts by well-meaning friends to play matchmaker. He came close to marriage 4 more times, but each time, something held him back. Meanwhile, life moved on for Carolyn, too. She married Owen Jones, an architect and pilot, and had 2 children. In what seems like fate's sense of humor, she later remarked that her husband was very much like Ratan. But this is not the end. In 2007, while watching The Darjeeling Limited, a movie about 3 brothers traveling through India, Carolyn found herself overwhelmed with memories of Ratan and their time together. She looked him up online, discovering the global business leader he'd become. Until then, she had no idea. So taking a chance, she sent him an email. You know what they say, where there's smoke, there's still a spark. And to her surprise, he responded. In 2008, after nearly 50 years apart, Carolyn spent 5 weeks in India, reconnecting with her first love. What could have been awkward or painful instead became something beautiful, a deep friendship that would last until Tata's final days. She attended his 80th birthday celebration in 2017, and they stayed in touch right up until his passing in October 2024. When asked about their relationship, both spoke of it with a mixture of fondness and acceptance of how things had turned out. Through all his success, transforming the Tata Group from a $5 billion domestic company into a $100 billion global enterprise, Ratan Tata never forgot that young architect in Los Angeles who had dreamed of a different life. In rare moments of candor, he would admit, "I think it would have been wonderful to have a family." As his career wound down, Ratan found new ways to make a difference. He became one of India's most active startup investors, mentoring young entrepreneurs and supporting innovation. He donated billions to education, healthcare, and rural development. The man who gave up his chance at a family became a father figure to millions. When Ratan Tata passed away on October 9, 2024, tributes poured in from around the world.